Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burn. Last week we saw the annual World Economic Forum in Davos, a place where the world used to come together to explore how to collaborate on addressing the world's greatest challenges. But I think this year what stood out most was how far apart everything feels. Beneath the language of dialogue and cooperation, Davos 2026 reflected a world moving in the opposite direction. It seems to be moving towards stronger nationalism, more authoritarian policies, fractured trade, and weakening global norms. It seems like the assumption that we can solve shared problems through shared rules, the thing that's always underpinned action on climate and sustainability, is no longer a given. And that shift matters enormously for climate, nature, and resilience, because sustainability is built on ideas of coordination and cooperation, common standards, long time horizons, and a basic level of trust between states, markets, and institutions. But at Davos, leaders talked about risk and uncertainty and resilience without really confronting the political reality shaping those risks. That's a changing world order where power is concentrating, cooperation is becoming harder, and economic strategy is increasingly a tool of geopolitical competition. The issue is that however fragmented or polarized the politics becomes, the underlying physics doesn't change. Markets can disagree. Governments can delay action. Leaders can dispute the science if they want to. Some of them are even confusing climate with weather. But the risk keeps accumulating all the same. And that is why some institutions are reacting very differently. Central banks, insurers, financial supervisors. If you think about it, it's the parts of the system that look at the longest time horizon. They're increasingly focused on climate and nature as a systemic risk. In the UK, we even had the Institute of Actuaries coming out with a report that talked about planetary solvency. They're asking harder questions about exposure and resilience, and whether or not today's business models still make sense under tomorrow's conditions. And that's where the data matters. So today, I'm welcoming Sherry Madera, the Chief Executive of CDP, to talk to us not only about what actually she saw at Davos, but where CDP's work cuts through the politics. We're going to talk about its latest corporate health check, and the fact that it's not measuring ambition or intent, which is what we've often seen with targets being set and declarations of ambition. What it measures is preparedness, and it's showing that a small group of companies is really moving decisively ahead, but a huge number of them, they're still structurally opposed to physical risk, transition risk, and nature loss. The issue is that those things are already being priced in by insurers, lenders, and regulators. So in a world where political consensus seems to be weakening, who is actually building the resilience that we depend on? So Sherry, welcome to the show. I've painted rather a dire picture of what was happening at Davos. Can you tell me what it was like being there, how you felt? And when you look back at the conversations you had and that you heard, what really dominated the conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Felicia, for starting off where we should, which is the big picture. And I was delighted to be at Davos again. And I think it was a bit of a tale of two halves on the ground. The first half was the lead up to Trump's speech, and the second half was the digestion of it. And does that put geopolitics at the top of the list? Yeah, it does, because I think that, especially this year at Davos, we saw business struggling with uncertainty, understanding how it is that, the things that were unfolding in society, politics, and the economy were all coming together to understand what is the path forward. But underneath that, actually, when we think about the geopolitics and the speeches, there was some really, really inspiring moments of clarity. I don't have it to hand, but I'm waving my Canadian flag as a Canadian. Mark Carney's speech really cut through And that idea of middle powers not being middling, and the change of understanding how economies, trade, security might be different tomorrow than it was in the past world order, was really something that caught the attention of business people, governments, regulators, and those leaders who are walking up and down the promenade. I do think that geopolitics also is influencing what we do every day at CDP. CDP has been the world's climate and nature data platform for over 25 years. 25 years, Felicia, that's a long time. And the question we should ask is, the data that we surface, how is that going to help take decisions now and in the future? And I think it's becoming more and more important to be able to ground decisions for businesses in the data, not just the macro data in terms of, you mentioned, but also what corporates are doing, because corporates make up about 82% of the world's GDP. So if we think that government and government spending is going to solve things like the climate crisis or be able to protect nature, I think we're being a bit foolhardy. We do need to think about what corporates are doing today and tomorrow. And certainly I think that is where that falling through.
I'm fascinated by the question of corporates saying or doing things, because there has been a lot of discussion of ambition. There has been a growing recognition that increasing authoritarianism often goes hand in hand with lack of action, lack of investment into renewable energy sources, alternative, because authoritarianism is often about maintaining the status quo. Do you think there was a sense that companies are recognizing that sitting on the sidelines is no longer an option? Or do you think there is a sense that keep your head down and carry on is the best way forward?
No, I think that actually, and this is something that perhaps you might think is a bit odd, as the CEO of CDP, firmly believing that data is supporting a better, sustainable business. But I think that companies are saying actually it's about the economics, and if we talk about renewable energy or energy sources or energy mix as a great example of this, renewables are now cheaper than many fossil fuel options across the world and across supply chains. So we talked earlier about the geopolitics are top of the list when we were talking about Davos, but there are two other things that actually slid in underneath that, in my opinion, that really could give us an indication as to what businesses are thinking and doing. Thinking about growth in an uncertain market, and of course, I can't believe we've gotten to this minute of the podcast without saying AI. Because certainly that was all up and down Davos and up and
Sherry,
down the boardrooms.
Just to say, that was actually the key theme that came out of Davos. But there is such a challenge in the discussion of AI because it brings in energy demand, water demand, business model change, displacement of jobs. I almost feel as if it's that area that underpins everything, but actually, well, I suppose it's almost like climate, but on a different timescale. It completely transforms everything. Nobody understands the risks or where it's going. It needs to be part of every conversation. But if it becomes part of the conversation, it can kind of derail what's going on. So I'll be honest, I didn't know what to do with it. And I'm glad you brought it up because I do think it's a central part of the conversation. So let's get to it. What did they say at Davos about AI?
Well, I think that there is, as you said, this excitement because we see AI as a growth engine and a growth driver. That's, technology and innovation has always been thus. So if we think about sort of the circular argument that says, what are businesses excited about? They're thinking about how AI can drive both efficiency as well as new business models. And why is that exciting for those also at Davos, perhaps in the center of the onion, which is governments. And governments care about jobs and growth. I personally hope that that's sustainable jobs and sustainable growth. But at the same time, it's jobs and growth. And so if AI is going to be able to fashion that, it starts becoming that circular argument of how is it that countries and locations can win in terms of that jobs and growth trajectory. And part of that is where are data centers going to be located? They are a key engine for AI. And this is where that question about how is energy going to be used efficiently and effectively for an increase in data centers, and how is water going to play its role? There are some scary stats out there, Felicia. And the fact is that by 2030, demand for water is going to outstrip supply by 40%. And that's not far away. So if we pair all of these different trends and factors, AI, growth, jobs and growth, thinking about locations, where is it that fresh water is available, not only for a data center to use it all, but also for the community that you're going to be building around it. This becomes quite a intricate issue, and the decisions that corporates are making right now as to where it is that they partner, how it is that they build data centers, where is it that they put their precious resources for being able to drive AI, that is a question that's happening right now. And I'm actually really thrilled about it. And I'll tell you why. Because CDP has been surfacing information about about water use, about efficiency, about governance, about understanding circular economy on how it's being used and reused. We've been doing this for 12 years. Nobody cared, right? 12 years ago, right?
Yeah.
There were certain industries, very small, very focused industries, food, bev, and agriculture. This is a big part of what they do, as with apparel. But now it's every company that is starting to think, how is it that we understand that water usage piece? Because it may be a throttle to their opportunity to grow. That is great. Because it feels like water, and certainly this week has been Blue Davos, so a lot of discussion about water efficiency of all sorts. Getting that top of the agenda is a completely non-woke thing to talk about. So if we can lean into that, water, the environment, nature, locations, and climate, and how it is that a sustainability-driven future works together, that's linked up. So let's start with something that people want to talk about.
For sustainability to be such a fundamental part of that conversation is simply indicative of how much has changed. But I want to draw you out on that because we've talked about fragmentation. We've talked about these different elements that need to come together. How do you think that's shaping the way that climate and sustainability are keeping its role within that discussion at the World Economic Forum? And what do you think it tells us about how leaders perceive risk? And I'm particularly interested in terms of risk because of the fact that the Global Risk Report came out. And what I keep seeing is environmental risks are always a few years away or a couple of years away. And there's always something which is a greater priority, be it trade or geopolitics or misinformation or AI. But in the end, doesn't climate and sustainability underpin all of those things and our ability to deal with them?
Yes. Felicia, I think that you've said it right in the sense that risk is always just over the horizon. And what CDP has been doing over the last 25 years, certainly over the last 10 years, was ask questions about quantification of that risk. And as we rolled out our second year running corporate health check at Davos last week, we also asked the questions about what is going on with the relationship between leaders who are transparent and who are pulling levers in order to be sustainability leaders, and what's happening to the amount of money that they're allocating and what their market cap is doing. And that is really starting to create those links that really weren't there before, which is how is it that you create sort of a sustainable business model showed by all of your transparency and how is that being reacted to by investors, by the marketplace, and your own growth statistics? And it's good news. Between last year and this year, the number of leaders that have been identified. And we do this in partnership with Oliver Wyman, 2 years running, to get our methodology nice and rigorous. And we're seeing that 15% of the 10,000 companies that are part of the study were deemed leaders. And those 15% were either maintaining or higher in their market cap versus those that were not leaders. So there is definitely a opportunity there to match your market cap and your growth with doing a sustainable business model. Now, as we dig underneath, we need to think about that from which industries perspective, which geographies perspective. And we're seeing some clear winners on both of those as well. But I think that this is starting to make that link that you're talking about. Part of that is also those leaders are also, really moving away from only looking at risk. The risk is important to quantify, difficult to meet up with. But also there's an opportunity there. So over $200 billion just from that 15% leaders cohort, $200 billion was surfaced as opportunity that was highlighted because they are changing their business into a sustainable business. That's exciting as well. I know we spend a lot of time on risk, but the opportunity may be the carrot that we as humans and corporate leaders need in order to be able to deploy capital to make change.
I think that is perhaps one of the greatest challenges, is that because risk is a lever that is understood by finance departments and stock markets, etc., I think it's become the lever that we turn to. But that goes hand in hand with accusations of being alarmist. So having the conversation about potential, I think, is incredibly important. And I think given the number of different ways in which one can look at less extractive, more regenerative approaches to business, you can see where that's a really positive way of moving things forward. What's interesting here is you talk about that 15%, and I've really got two questions. One of which is, what does that number tell us in terms of what was happening at Davos? What does the fact that only about 15% of 10,000 companies can be qualified as environmental leaders, is that it's recognized, something that will filter down? Is it something you see as leftover from a previous era? Is it something that shows us how the challenges we heard about at Davos could be addressed? What do you think it says?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing to say is 15% seems small, but perhaps it puts into perspective that that number's gone up by 63% year on year. So there are more leaders this year than last year. And it also is, so what are the trends that we're seeing in that leadership cohort? It's very clear that those leaders are really prioritizing making sure that their executive teams, their executive pay is being linked to not only the targets that they're setting. Targets were very popular, Felicia, for many years, but it's also the transition. So it's about not only setting something to celebrate in many years coming, but actually year on year, how is it that the company is tracking against it so that you've got that transparency? I think that was a really important lever. The second one, and this links back to geopolitics again, goodness, we can't get away from it, can we? Which is trade and thinking about your supply chain. So those that are leaders are realizing that it's not just the boundaries of their factories, their footprints, their locations, their people that they are responsible for. But they're also looking down into their supply chains and understanding how is it that scope 3 type emissions data and water usage and all of those circularity as well as governance issues are actually being ricocheted through an important value chain. And that crosses borders. So I think that is a really key piece that we unearthed last year and this year, is that companies who are leaders are not just thinking about themselves, they're thinking about their ecosystem, they're thinking about their industry and that supply chain, and being able to not just be able to audit, but be able to go in and actually understand where is the best practice, how is it that they can actually be a partner for those suppliers in order to be able to change their energy mix to lower their carbon emissions, be able to create an efficiency drive for water, be able to understand sort of where their targets and their transitions are being able to benefit a more sustainable future. Because frankly, let's go back to business basics. Nobody wants to completely change their supply chain. Nobody wants to actually have that upheaval, especially in some of the larger multinationals that we work with. And so being able to actually be aware of what's happening within the supply chain, the challenges there, and helping actually starts becoming a much more resilient business at the top of that value chain.
I love hearing you talk about that, because one of the things that we talk about a lot at Shaken Not Burned is that data is fundamental to everything we need to do to change, but it's how you use data that defines whether you have a strategy or whether you're being reactive, whether you're moving forward in a powerful way. It makes me think of the fact that in the last 30, 40 years, most global supply chains have been optimized around the idea of just in time. Let's be as efficient as possible, get things there at the last minute. The pandemic threw a spanner in the works and made a whole load of people go, that's a really, really smart, sensible way of being efficient and optimizing and saving money, except if something happens. Because if you haven't got everything there because it wasn't due to be delivered until 2 weeks and now you can't get it from A to B, that's a huge cost. What that's really surfacing is this idea that people are becoming more aware of trade-offs, of nuance, that you can do things in one way, but you have to think about the consequences of actions. So I was fascinated to hear you talk about how what you're seeing in the leadership is an alignment of remuneration and reward with proper transition plans. And when I say proper, I mean they're built on data, they're strategic, there's capital put against them, and they're being implemented. What would be really interesting, if this is something you can speak to, is what does that actually look like on the ground? I mean, are you able to talk to what in practical terms these sorts of leading organizations are doing differently?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we talk about transition plans. Of course, you need to have one. Having a target is not enough anymore. We see that through our work with, over 640 of the world's largest investors. No longer are they giving any points or credence to a target without a transition plan. But then this word credible comes in. So a credible transition plan. and being able to see how you can track against it. And of course, that's, is something that CDP leans into in terms of our job of annually understanding how things move. And we have actually surfaced 21 different data points that are attributable to a, quote, credible transition plan. And the logic there is that if you are not measuring and managing these elements, how could you possibly be on track for your transition plan? You need to look at it. You need to be able to surface it. You need to be able to push that forward. So I think that that is one activity that we do see in terms of building that credibility. The other thing I really love to hear is when we work with our various different clients, some small, some big multinationals, when they actually push through, it's not just executive pay that's being linked to targets and transition, but actually everyone throughout the organization knows that this is part of the true north of what a company is looking to achieve. It's not just a quarterly earnings requirement. It is how do you secure your quarterly earnings in 3, in 5, in 10 years? And that's where this long-term initiative really takes hold, and you get bottom-up innovation that comes throughout your workforce, because they know from the top that these sustainable business activities are important. Great example is the procurement teams. These are teams who are obviously looking to maximize profitability. That is what corporates do, and we should celebrate that. However, the profitability may actually be impaired if you are choosing to be able to have long-term contracts with suppliers who are not achieving the goals that you have set as the top of the supply chain. That starts dragging down your ability to be able to call yourself a climate leader because you don't see how your downstream is working. So actually being involved with perhaps financiers, and again, this is something I'm really proud of at CDP, is working between the finance community, the supply chain owners, and the suppliers to say, how can we invest today and give some opportunity for CapEx to change the energy mix going forward in order to be able to change your fleet and your vehicles and your distribution for your transportation? How is it that actually you can look at what are those risks that we've identified and be able to say, how is it that $1 now can change into actually a $20 opportunity and upside? And that's something that we have identified through our disclosure dividend earlier last year. So these things are becoming much more financially managed. And that, I think, is where the difference is don't talk about saving the planet. Again, people might take a sharp intake of breath for me to say that. But actually, this is all about making sure that planet and profit are being able to be worked together because it's good business. That is actually the thing that should be inspiring everyone.
I really appreciate you making that point, because I'm one of those people who came up in the world of nature is a public good. It should be protected. You shouldn't price things that are priceless. But the fundamental truth is we live in the world in which we live, and we haven't got very much time to act. And that means we have to put as much pressure as we possibly can on the levers that we do have for change. And in the end, that is finance, corporate action, government response to the private sector. And it sounds to me like what you're talking about, the work you're doing at CDP is almost like providing a translation layer between the data that you're identifying and actually helping companies understand how to change that data into actionable knowledge that helps them drive jobs and growth. So it's about saying jobs and growth are the most important things to these particular actors in the system, be that financial systems, governments, or companies. But this is how doing things in the right way, in a positive way, in, a more sustainable way, can actually be shown to have benefits that matter to you. And I'm definitely going to add a link to the disclosure dividend in the show notes, because I think that's a really, really important thing for people to read about. I want to bring it back to something really basic, which is this idea of, well, not so much idea of, but the trope that climate action or sustainability, that integrating that into your business undermines competitiveness. And I've heard arguments that the small number of environmental and climate leading companies are that way because they're large enough that they can afford to do it and it doesn't affect the rest of their business. Now, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's what the data shows, but it's something I hear again and again. So what does your data actually show for boards and for investors about that idea that climate or sustainability action is a trade-off against competitiveness? Because from what you've said, that's not the case. But can we be really explicit about what your position is?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're talking about businesses and we're sitting in the position of a CEO or a board director, why? Why are they doing this work? And how is it that disclosure, obviously our bread and butter, how does that help them achieve that profitability and that excellence in terms of market cap?
Yeah.
I'll give let's get simple, right? Frankly, surfacing all this data for data's sake is a hiding to nothing. It has to be used. And really, when you look at it from a C-suite perspective, why do companies do this? Let's keep it simple. There are 3 reasons. The first is access to capital. The second is business efficiency and protecting your top line for your P&L, your customers asking. So access to capital, business efficiency, and compliance. And if we've got the ABCs of disclosure, and we're able to say that these same data points are going to be used by that company for achieving all of those, let's give some examples. So if we think about Amundi, a very large asset manager, they use CDP's scores. So being able to have that transparency and that leadership scored as an ABC. The A's are creating a universe for investment. And so if you are not achieving sort of the AA, you are outside of the universe of that fund. And we're seeing this increasingly, and we're seeing this with more delicacy. So, for example, Archaea, a fund management, started a fund based on CDP A scores for water in December of last year. If you do not have that A score, you are out of the universe. So again, these are really specific things. And if you're thinking, well, you know what, that's a universe I don't want to be in. If you look at BBVA, the Spanish bank, they issued a 2.5 billion euro loan to Iberdrola, the energy company, on the basis of them maintaining their A score. So again, this is a lower cost of capital on a 2.5 billion euro loan note. That is absolutely caring, that you're going to care about that. So again, that A has really good examples. That access to capital has good examples of why. It's the same data, Felicia, that the companies are asking you if you are your customer. And this is where we're getting the biggest growth in our disclosures, is that companies for the last 5 years at CDP have been really sitting up and saying, I need to actually do this disclosure and I need to show year-on-year benefits and I need to talk to my customer because they're asking for it. So we work with over 250 of the world's largest supply chain owners. And this is real money. This is $6.5 trillion that they are actually using the data that comes from the supply chain to make decisions on procurement. That's pretty compelling. And of course, your compliance use case is something that should be benefiting from the fact that you're doing all this work to protect your business and therefore to make sure that downstream, when you need to be actually not only disclose, but actually some of these regulators are going to be setting what does good look like soon enough. You're going to be prepared for that. And that isn't a tax on your business. Again, let's convert this into monetary language because that is exactly what it should be and it is right now. So that I think is the compelling reason why we can link back how a company is looking in terms of profitability, in terms of market cap, in terms of growth, in terms of retention of jobs. It really does come back to being able to be a good, sustainable business leader.
And I absolutely love that. I'm really grateful that you were able to break it down that simply and that cleanly into those 3 elements, because I think that provides a response to a number of different arguments. Because if you're doing the compliance anyway, you really should not be just spending money on compliance, but using the money you've spent to build your business in a more effective way. But also, given the arguments that have been going on recently about levels of compliance on disclosure and what's happening, certainly in Europe, in the US, there has been this sense that, the foot's been taken off the accelerator in terms of compliance. What you're talking about is even without clear compliance benefits, there are other benefits that are huge and increasing. And then, of course, there's the obvious one that there's a lot of discussion in a lot of local, and when I say local, I mean national, newspapers about the retreat from disclosure and compliance. But China just introduced double materiality climate disclosure, which is a hell of a lot more pressure than the EU's ISSB-based single materiality, which is just what risks does the world, does nature, does climate have on your business. The reality is, if you look at this from a global perspective, and trade is global, the direction of travel is increased disclosure, increasingly rigorous disclosure, and increasing demand for understanding far beyond emissions into, as you say, it's not just energy, it's water, it's resource management, it's fundamentally the relationship between what a company does and how a society functions. And if you think it's moving in any other direction than that, you seem to be missing a trick. And that sort of brings me back to Davos. Was that part of the discussion? Or is that something that is completely obvious to those people who think in systems and not necessarily something that's obvious to people who are worried about where the next war's coming from? And I don't mean to be glib, but sometimes it's really hard for those different time horizons to match.
Absolutely. And I think that, when you come back to Davos, we need to think about the words that were being used this year versus perhaps 5 years ago. ESG, environmental, carbon, emissions. These were words from the past. And, the words that were being used now are resilience, thinking about sort of pricing, thinking about, the environmental impacts of risk. Physical risk is huge on the agenda. I mean, some of our research has shown sort of $1.4 trillion worth of physical risk is being identified, which is great to identify. So what are you going to do about it? In fact, only 84 billion of those identified $1.4 trillion worth of physical risks have been allocated capital in order to be able to mitigate them. And again, maybe the word that we're also using alongside resilience now is adaptation. And Felicia, if you'll spare me a moment, which is, that's really sad, right? Because as humans, it means that mitigation, which is what we've been talking a lot about from the climate agenda, isn't enough anymore. And we need to think about how adaptation, adapting your business, adapting the way that we are living and working to secure a strong growth, sustainable future, is part of the new lexicon. And if that's the case, actually, maybe we should just take a minute. I should get over it. And we should think about, well, this is actually a very positive narrative because it lends itself to that positive jobs growth innovation. And we as societies, we as industries, we as corporates, we love an innovation story and we get behind it and we put money behind it. So actually, when you talk about Davos and we come right back around to that AI and innovation agenda, I guess I question, is sustainability off the agenda? Or are we just using different words? And should we celebrate that? Because 1.5 degree alignment, what does that mean to you, Felicia? What does that mean to me? What does that mean to the businesses here in London down the street? I think we got things a little bit wrong, if we're going to be candid. That doesn't land and be able to understand. If we can convert that language into profitability, into minimizing costs, creating efficiency, maximizing top line, being able to actually, I think maybe that actually this shift is a good one to put sustainability right at the center without even calling it that.
I absolutely love that because it speaks to so many things that I fundamentally believe. We have this huge emergency that we're dealing with and people are saying we've got to make everyone aware of the emergency, but in the end, people care about what's in front of them. We talk about the food system a lot and how vulnerable it is. But talking to someone about the food system doesn't really mean anything to them if they can't get coffee. That means something. If they can't get avocados or nuts or fish fingers. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. It's if something changes at your table, if you can't afford something, if it's not available, it speaks to people's realities. I'm fascinated by that shift. Because the fact that only 84 billion has been invested in addressing over 1.4 trillion in physical climate risk or environmental risk, that's huge and tiny, but also meaningless. Because what does it mean? These macro levels of the way we talk about money, and people are going, yeah, but I'm slightly worried because I think my job won't exist in a year because of AI and I've got kids to feed. And as human beings, I think when we're afraid, the fight or flight kicks in, and that is not the best time to have a really serious conversation about how to best collaborate and move things forward, because human beings, when they're afraid, are not at their best. There's no doubt about it. So I take what you say really close to heart, and I think resilience can go hand in hand with mitigation. We can adapt and mitigate at the same time. I think one of the challenges is it's always easier to think about things in binary ways. It's this or that, not maybe we can do a bit of this and a bit of that and we'll see what's happening. But I think I want to really get your thoughts on what changes, if anything, after Davos. There's so much uncertainty. Do you think there is a case for waiting until there's clearer political guidance, global consensus, or is the reality that that's going to be a very long wait and we need to take action now? What do you think?
Well, it's not what I think. I think it's what the corporate community thinks and what it's been sharing with me and with CDP. And what does the data say?
Yeah.
And what the data says is that there is a consistency. We've got stability in terms of disclosure. And I feel passionately that what you can measure, you can manage. And when we talk about transition plans and thinking about the future and planning, not only on an audit previously, but thinking about sort of what's going forward, those data points are continuing to be surfaced. I think that the community is, the corporate and economy are continuing to get on with things. Are they shouting from the rooftops? No. Are they sharing best practices in smaller industry-led, sectoral-focused groupings? Absolutely. And so I think that there is a quiet getting on with it going on. And of course, I'm Canadian, but I'm also British. And the keep calm, carry on is a phrase I think that we're working with a lot of corporates. Don't get me wrong, there are many corporates who are shouting from the rooftops, who are saying that this is an absolutely essential part of their business model. But perhaps there are less of those than there were a few years ago. And that shouldn't be because the media and the public and those outside might say, well, that means that there's less going on. Don't be fooled, because the data is still being surfaced and is still being used because the ABCs we talked about are still fundamental business needs, and stakeholders understand that.
That's amazing. I'm going to ask you my final question, which is, if we're sitting here after Davos next year, what would meaningful progress look like to you? So not in terms of commitments, but in terms of how companies measure success, resilience, and long-term value.
I think that part of it is continuing to get that measurement and management stable and increasing. I think we've had a year of uncertainty, if we can use that trite word. We're going to have another one. And so I think that part of this is saying, all right, we've maintained sort of that stability of continuing to measure things, but maybe we can actually increase that, be even more even more forensic about how it is that you go through your supply chains. These supply chains are not just about a sustainable supply chain. They are also about a supply chain that are going to be buffeted potentially by geopolitics, by trade, by tariffs. So now is the time to actually continue to surface that data and understand how it is that you're going to use it. The other thing I'll say is let's double down on what we learned from Davos this year. Water can be a Trojan horse in the conversation for thinking about climate and nature. At CDP, instead of saying climate and nature, we call it earth positive because these things are moving together. So if Blue Davos this year can really start thinking about how can you create an index and efficiency and understanding how to use water, it's something that Ecolab and CDP announced last week. So we're doing our part. If a year's time, we can start seeing how that can be measured and managed in terms of where water has been going, I think that we're doing a good job.
I think that's a fantastic place to draw our interview to a close. The one thing I will ask before I finish, is there anything I haven't asked you about that I should have done?
Oh, you've been very well informed. I think the only thing is geography. What we surfaced was that the Japanese are storming ahead, and the Chinese and the Europeans in terms of leadership when we did our corporate health check. I found that interesting. Part of it is cultural. As cultural business leaders, Japanese are very thorough about how they are meeting the requests of investors, of their clients, et cetera. So, a thorough transparency is partially cultural. However, 22% of Japanese companies were in that leadership band, which is very impressive if you consider that Europe and the UK, which came next, are much more perhaps established in the narrative, the global narrative about sustainability. Certainly the UK and Europe are seen as being leaders there, but Japan still tops it when it comes to the action.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Sherry, thank you so much for your time. You must be exhausted having been at Davos last week, but I really, really appreciate it. And I think for our listeners, you've brought us some really important home truths, because the reality is those larger companies that are acting, that are being captured by international disclosure requirements, there is a cascade effect, because at the moment they may only be looking at their top tier, their tier one suppliers. But in the end, everybody is somebody's supplier and the information has to come from somewhere. So if you're not planning ahead, you could well be caught out. And when it comes to Davos, I think Davos 2026 made one thing abundantly clear, and that is that we're no longer operating in a world that is defined by the convergence of collaboration and cooperation. We're operating in a world that seems to increasingly be defined by power and who has it, by fragmentation and contested norms. And that doesn't make climate and nature and water less important. What it does is it makes them more politically charged. It makes the way we address them more uneven. And at the same time, I think it's more revealing of who's in charge of risk, who holds risk, and who bears it, who's going to suffer from it. We do have data from CDP that shows a small group of organisations is already adapting to a new reality. They're building resilience, they're investing earlier, and they're treating sustainability, resilience, if we want to call it that, as strategic capacity. Many companies, however, are still behaving as if everything is going to go back to whatever normal used to be. And I think that's the real risk. In a world where we have this kind of fragmentation, waiting for alignment, it's not sensible caution, it's exposure to uncertainty. The companies and institutions that are going to thrive, I think, are the ones that are already designing for uncertainty. And they're building on what Sherry has called the stability of disclosure frameworks and our awareness and understanding of data, delivering on those 3 ABCs that Sherry talked about, diversifying the dependencies in the supply chain, investing in resilience even if policy isn't clear, grounding decisions in long-term risks rather than short-term politics. That's how you thrive. So if we're having this conversation again next year, meaningful progress isn't going to be about rhetoric and pledges. It's going to show up in who's standing when shocks hit, who is going out there and making sure they're able to adapt and to thrive. And I suppose most importantly, who built the capacity to absorb those shocks and bounce back from them. And that's the uncomfortable through line, but really, really beneficial for those companies who are actually taking action. For our listeners, I hope you found today's conversation interesting. I personally found it fascinating. I think the question isn't where the politics is going to land. It's whether or not the systems that underpin our economy, our societies, whether they're being built to thrive under pressure. So thanks for listening to Shake and Not Burn today. If this episode helped you think a little bit more clearly about what sustainability might mean in a fractured world, then don't forget, share it, subscribe it, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you, Felicia.